Okay, so good evening, everybody. My name is Donna Schneider. I'm the president of the Prince George's County Historical Society. We ask that you kindly mute yourself as we are recording this chat. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation, so please type any questions you may have in the, I think it's the chat box, yes, chat box. And we will get to them at the end and ask as many of them as we can. If you enjoyed tonight's history chat, please consider making a donation or becoming a society member. And you can find out more information at our website, www.pghistory.org. Now for tonight's history chat with Professor William Thomas. Susan G. Pearl, our society historian, will have a conversation with Professor Thomas about his book, A Question of Freedom: The Families Who Challenged Slavery from the Nation's Founding to the Civil War. They will chat about some of the individuals and families profoundly affected by the processes of these freedom suits. Professor Thomas is a professor of history at the University of Nebraska. He received his BA in history at Trinity College and his MA and PhD in history at the University of Virginia. He was co-founder and director of the Virginia Center for Digital History at the University of Virginia. Tonight's book has just won the 2020 Mark Linton History Prize, the citation of which describes the book as, quote, astonishing and monumental, unquote. In just a few months, it has aroused great interest in our area. It tells the story of enslaved individuals and families in Prince George's County and who sued for their freedom the courts of Maryland and the District of Columbia. Some of the names of the slave owners and of the lawyers who represented those suing for their freedom will be very familiar to those in Prince George's County. And we will learn from the powerful book the long processes that the plaintiffs went through, the successes and the failures, and the generations of the families involved. Susan, please begin.
Thank you, and welcome, Will. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you.
3 years ago, exactly, May 24th, 2008, you kind of tossed a bombshell into Prince George's County. As the guest speaker at our annual historic preservation reception, you told us about your work on enslaved Prince George's. I'm sorry, did somebody say something? Okay, I thought you were telling me to stop. Okay, at that occasion, you told us about your work on enslaved Prince Georgians who sued their owners and sought freedom through the courts, and they very often won. I was astonished, for I had worked for more than 30 years on topics related to slavery in our county. Manumissions by deed and will, runaways, both successful and unsuccessful, the movement towards colonization, and of course, personal writings, both by slave owners and by those enslaved. But I had not known, except for Charles Mahoney, I had not known anything about those suits. Your book on the subject, A Question of Freedom, has created a stir, a real stir among research historians, and even among the perfectly normal population. I cannot imagine how busy you must be just responding to the reactions since the book's release exactly 6 months ago. So I hope, Will, that you'll start by talking a bit about the main theme and purpose of the book and how you got into the subject.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Donna. And it's a delight to be here for History Chats. And I hope we'll do this as a chat, back and forth, and ask questions and talk about this history, this vitally important history. It's vitally important to our nation's history. And the more I researched these legal questions, these freedom suits, the more I saw them as right at the very center of the American story. these families in Maryland, the Queens, the Mahoneys, the Ducketts, the Shorters and the Thomases and many others, challenged slavery from day one of the United States, and actually before the United States, challenged slavery in the law, through the law, using freedom suits, even before the Revolution, the American Revolution. So, so I think it's a vitally important story to the history of the United States, and it of course is an important story to the history of Maryland and the history of Prince George's County. I ended up really focusing on Prince George's County, but there were freedom suits in other counties on the Western Shore. I reached the conclusion, though, that the ones in Prince George's County really were in many ways the ones that posed the greatest challenge to the legality, if you will, of slavery. And this was one of the things that I didn't really realize. Well, first of all, when I started on this research, I knew about freedom suits, but I really only knew about the Dred Scott case, the infamous decision of the Supreme Court in 1857 that essentially declared that Black persons were not persons under the meaning of the law or the Constitution, and that case is, you know, one of the most infamous in American history, and it was a freedom suit from out of Missouri, but it's 1857, so very late in the history of American slavery. I just had no grasp of this earlier history in Maryland and of so many freedom suits that were filed in Maryland, and then the same families filing further freedom suits in Washington, D.C. And I'll come back to that in just a second, how I got into this. But so I didn't know about the early freedom suits. And, you know, I also had a kind of an assumption, which I think many Americans have right now, which is that slavery was somehow, you know, stable. It was like unchanging. It was stable in the law. Like the law made it somehow the law made it lawful or legal. And the more I looked at the freedom suits and the more I studied how these families sued slaveholders and what those lawsuits really meant, I realized that, and this is at the heart of the book, that slavery was never legally stable. It was always being challenged as illegal, as unlawful, as not in accord with natural law, with English common law. And in particular in Maryland, because Maryland's Constitution in 1776 stated that all inhabitants of Maryland had the right of English common law, you know? So that statement in the Maryland Constitution raised profound questions about whether slavery, what was its legal sanction? Was it legitimate or not? And these cases brought by the Queen family and the Mahoney family in particular raised that question in Maryland. So those were some of these phones.
Excuse me, can people please mute themselves?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm not muted.
There we go. Okay, so those were the two things that I didn't know about the early freedom suits really at all. And I did not know, or I did not realize that slavery could be legally questioned and challenged in this way. Very briefly, Susan, I started on this because I was interested in one freedom suit in particular by the Queen family. It was brought in Washington, D.C., and it eventually went to the Supreme Court in 1813, and it's Queen v. Hepburn. And that case is right at the center of the book, because that in that case, there were, when I first heard about it, I didn't realize Francis Scott Key was a lawyer. I mean, I hadn't really even focused on that. I'm a historian, and I didn't really know much about Francis Scott Key, much less that Key represented the Queens in front of the Supreme Court in this freedom suit. And his argument was that all of this evidence about their freedom, about their ancestors' freedom, should be led into court, should be allowed to be heard, even though it was secondhand testimony, or what attorneys call hearsay. And so Francis Scott Key was involved in this story, and one of the judges on the Supreme Court, Gabriel Dull, was issued a dissent in that case. It's one of the only times that he actually writes anything in the Supreme Court. In 25 years of sitting on the bench, he's silent for 25 years, and then he issues like this important dissent in Queen v. Hepburn, in which he says, it will be universally admitted that the right to freedom is more important than the right of property. Well, that was the question. That was the question of freedom right in front of the Supreme Court. And the court, as many of you know, decided in favor of the slaveholder, John Hepburn, and ruled a lot of the Queen's evidence as inadmissible, as hearsay, and therefore not allowed in court. And the Minor Queen and her daughter, Louisa, remained enslaved. Now, when I first started to do this research, I went to the National Archives and I pulled the case file for their case. And the archivist at National Archives came out from behind the desk and said, have you seen this? And he pulled off the shelf this 3-ring binder of all cases brought in Washington, D.C. that where Black people were either plaintiffs or defendants or a witness. And it was an index of Black Washingtonians, he called it. And the staff at the National Archives had put together this fabulous index of every single legal case in, whether it's a freedom suit or anything else, in Washington, D.C. So I opened it up to 1810, and there is the Queen, there's the Queen case. But what blew my mind was there were 5 other cases by the Queen family. And so what I slowly began to realize was that there were hundreds of these freedom suits. I went to Annapolis, to the Maryland State Archives, pulled the Queen case file from the 1790s and the judgment records of the court, of the General Court of the Western Shore. And there were hundreds of freedom suits by other families and by the Queens. And so the story here is that there were freedom suits from day one of the United States, and that these challenged slavery in ways that I didn't realize, and that they were family-based, they were intergenerational, and they were early, long before Dred Scott. And then last, they were highly significant because they literally put slaveholders on trial defending slavery. So that's how I got into this, Susan. I started pulling the threads of these cases, following wherever who were the slaveholders, who were the attorneys, how many of them were there, and then following their descendants through the generations from the 1780s on through to the Civil War. and beyond to today, because there are descendants of these families who sued for freedom right on this call tonight. So.
Well, I'm certainly glad you got into it, because you've opened up a whole lot to those of us who have been trying to work on things like this or things related to this. This is just magnificent. But let me ask you, this is the question that comes to me all the time. And I understand why it is the most frequent question. And we've all tried to stab at answering it. How do you think that people learned that they could go to court, that they could take these complaints to the courts? How did they get to the courts? How did they find attorneys to represent them? I know we've all sort of speculated about it, but I'd love to hear what you would say, because this is a question that comes to me all the time.
Yeah. Sure, it's a really important question. It says a lot. It tells us a lot about our assumptions, and I think that's one of the things I want to talk about right now tonight is the assumptions that are behind that question, and the assumptions that many Americans have about slavery and about how it could be challenged. Essentially, many scholars previously have dismissed the freedom suits as sort of led by abolition societies, by white attorneys who were working with various abolition societies. And there was a Maryland Abolition Society, as y'all know, in 1789, 1790, there was a Maryland Abolition Society with a couple hundred members, and there were lawyers like Samuel Chase and Jeremiah Townley Chase, who were part of the Abolition Society. And the Abolition Society did do some legal work, especially in Baltimore, and I think also on the Eastern Shore. But the assumption was that white attorneys sort of were doing this for abolitionist reasons. And the other assumption that I think previous scholars made and that many Americans have today is that the freedom suits really weren't that important. They were just about one family. They were just about or one person. In fact, Dred Scott, we tend to think of Dred Scott as one person, right? Because of the Dred Scott case. But it's a case that is about his two daughters and his wife, Harriet. So even the Dred Scott case is a family freedom suit. And in many ways, it's similar to what happened in Maryland in the early period. And so we need to think of these, and the way I would answer this is really simple. And I will say that I thought a lot about this as I was writing the book. I did not realize at first how important this question is that you're asking. How did these people figure it out? How did they do it? How did Mina Queen and her daughter, how did Mina Queen or Priscilla, how did Priscilla Queen sue the president of Georgetown College, a Jesuit, the Reverend Francis Neal? How did she do it? How did she figure it out? That's what you're asking. And I think it's an absolutely fundamental question, because it raises for us the question of what is our assumption about enslaved people and what they could and could not do. And the answer, I don't have the answer. I'm giving you one answer, which is I think we need to change our understanding about these families, about enslaved families, about their sophistication, their legal sophistication, their knowledge, they're passing on of knowledge through generations. They are political actors. They act in the political world of early America. Charles Mahoney is a political force to be reckoned with. He was an enslaved man, but he acted, and his family acted as independent political actors in that society. Now, how did they come into contact with attorneys? This was one of the most lawyered societies in the world, right? There were courthouses in every county. There was a general court in Annapolis. There are lawyers everywhere. This is a lawyered place. There are, I mean, I think I'm right, just right around White Marsh Plantation, where the Jesuits are and the Queens are enslaved and the Mahoneys are enslaved. I mean, there's Gabriel Dull and Allen Bowie Duckett and several other attorneys who are literally on contiguous properties. So practically. So there are, this is the law mattered in colonial Britain, British colonies, colonial British North America. The courts mattered in early United States. And here's the last point on this, I think. These families are 3 generations and 5 generations deep in Maryland. When Charles Mahoney and Edward Queen sue the Reverend John Ashton in 1791, their families are respectively 3, 4, 5 generations in Maryland. They have largely been able to maintain their kinship networks and their, I think that my point is that many Americans vastly underestimate the sophistication, the political will, the courage, the determination, and the self-understanding of these families and of enslaved people generally. And so I think part of it is about our assumptions and changing those. And if we can do that, I think we'll begin to see that the freedom suits were not just one thing, one person. They were concerted efforts. They were coordinated. They were coordinated not by the white attorneys, not by Gabriel Dull. I mean, he does represent more than 120 people, but they're coordinated by the families themselves. And that's what I try to make clear in the book is just how not only significant these suits were, but how these families coordinated what they were doing.
Yes. Yeah, that's wonderful. It's obvious that there were chains of connection within families and between families. And they went back and forth between plantations, and the lawyers went back and forth too. That was their entertainment. They went for tea, they went for dinner for overnight. And so everybody would have been mixing all the time. And people would learn and they would pass it on. And yes, it's very impressive. And it's the first thing that you think about when you start reading about it. You already talked about Gabriel Dull, and I was going to ask you to speak specifically about Gabriel Dull because in your book, he is the one person who comes out very clearly on both sides. I mean, he represents over 100 people who are seeking freedom, and then he himself is sued by his own slaves, which makes him, well, puts him on both sides. We could talk all night about him, so maybe we should put him aside a little bit unless you want to you've already talked about his dissent on the Supreme Court in the case of Queen v. Hepburn, and
Right.
His very passionate dissent. But then, of course, not too many years later, he is sued by his own
Right.
Butler family. Do you want to say something? We shouldn't spend too much time on him because we're all going to run out of time in a moment,
Yeah.
unless you'd want to sum up somehow.
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. Gabriel Dull is a lawyer who is, a widower in the early 1790s. And as best I can tell, in the early 1790s, he just throws himself into the law. He's very active in Maryland, in both in court and in the political scene. He what just really surprised me, not only about Dull, but about the Mahoney freedom suit, is that over the course of now this is a freedom suit that took 12 years, right? I mean, this is a freedom suit that had 3 jury trials. And in the course of the litigation, Dull becomes appointed to the bench. He's the judge now of the very court in Annapolis that the freedom suit will be heard in. And then he's appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States at the very moment when the Queen case comes before the Supreme Court. In fact, Dull was a witness at the jury trial for Mina Queen, and he had been their attorney back in the 1790s. So you can see, first of all, how long his involvement is, right? So those freedom suits were filed in 1791, and he is a witness for the Queens in 1810. So 19 years later, he's a witness for Mina Queen, and then he's on the Supreme Court, and he issues that dissent we were talking about. He's involved from the beginning, and he's probably the one lawyer more than any other in Maryland who really introduced the concept of hearsay, of depositions taken about the status of these families and their ancestors, because they are making the claim that they are descended from a free person, a free woman, a free white woman in some cases, the Butlers, a free African woman or Black woman in some cases, like the Mahonies. And so Dull has really been at the heart of introducing all of these depositions, and Maryland allowed them all. Maryland courts heard all this evidence. And so that is partly why he dissents in the Supreme Court when it comes up to the Supreme Court. But, what surprised me, last point on this, is I just didn't realize how the Mahoney freedom suit played a role in the politics of Maryland. I mean, all of the Federalists are on one side, and all of the Republicans, the Jeffersonians, are on the other. And Dull is like the lone Jeffersonian Republican in Prince George's County, practically. And he assembles this group of lawyers, including John Johnson and others who are Republicans. Now, the politics of this are really complicated and very different from what we might expect. And the outcome takes many twists and turns. And I try to follow that through in the book. But I guess I would say Dull is this sort of Republican attorney who really wishes to promote the liberty of the individual, and it's the Federalists who are stuck in the hereditary sort of colonial mindset in his view. And it is ironic that in the 1820s, he's sued by the Butler.
Excited by the she was excited about the
So yeah, so he is sued by the Butler family, and he tries he tries to deflect their suit. I mean, he acts like every other slaveholder acts at that moment, and defends his own slaveholding.
Well, we could go on talking about Gabriel Dull for a long time, but I want to get one quick thing in that's a little bit off the subject, but most of you, I think, know about the Oh Say Can You See website. I hope you do. I'm using it all the time these days, and I wanted Will to sort of explain the relationship between that valuable website and the book.
Sure. I'm going to put the website link right in the chat there for you. When I saw that index that I told you about at National Archives of all of the cases in Washington, D.C., the first thing that went through my head was, wow, this is so amazing. The networks of families that are showing up in these cases, and the importance of the cases themselves. And so before I even went to Maryland, to the Maryland State Archives, I was really focused back in 2011 and 12 on what was happening in Washington, D.C., and what the National Archives held in its records of all of these freedom suits and all of these cases in Washington. And so I immediately thought I should try to digitize these and get them out to researchers and scholars, because I think if people knew about these freedom suits or about these cases, they would learn a lot about early American history. And these suits held evidence of ancestry, of family relationships that were described in the documents and in the depositions and in the suits themselves. And so I thought this would be immensely important to genealogists, and anybody interested in this history would find incredible value. So I immediately was really thinking, Susan, about creating a digital site. Now, what of course happened is all the DC cases had predecessor cases in Maryland, and like the Queen case, where that's a DC freedom suit in 1810, but all of the evidence that was introduced in Washington, DC had been taken in Maryland in the 1790s and was all part of the Queen freedom suits in Maryland. So what happened was, I went from Washington, D.C. to Maryland State Archives and saw the judgment books from the court in Annapolis. And all of a sudden there were, so many more freedom suits by the same families. And so I realized, okay, now all of the Maryland cases need to be added to. You can't understand the Queen v. Hepburn case in Washington, D.C. without knowing about the earlier freedom suits. And so the website has more than 500 freedom suits from Washington, D.C. in Washington, D.C. over the whole period from 1800 to 1860 to 63. And we have added all of the predecessor freedom suits in Maryland. So all of those Maryland State Archives freedom suits by the various families are in the Oh Say Can You See archive. And, it's used in schools, it's used by teachers, it's certainly used by researchers and scholars. And it's been incredible to see that web site really provide just incredible stories for teaching, and also for incredible resources for families to look at the original documents and see the testimony of people who, including free Black witnesses, who testified in these cases about their family's genealogy.
Yes, it's a wonderful collection of learning about the people, as you say, the witnesses, the attorneys who represented the families, all the details. That sort of leads me to another question, which has been bothering me a little bit. When I look at newspaper ads for runaways, the owner, when one of his slaves or several of his slaves have escaped, he will put an ad in the local newspaper offering a reward for anyone who will return his man or his people to him. And of course, this is pretty frequent. We had a lot of large slave owners in Prince George's County, and they're often putting in ads to get their escapees back. I started looking at these in some detail, and then going and looking for the same names, the same slave owners in the cases that are there in your website. And I find no relationship. Maybe one of all the people who frequently put in runaway ads. So I was wondering, why would a runaway who maybe was returned to his owner, why wouldn't he consider going to court? Or vice versa. If, but I never found a coordination between the two. And I wonder if you have an idea, first of all, if you have an idea whether runaways are unlikely to go to court, or people who go to court are unlikely to run away, or are there lots more cases coming into the website that may bring some of those different people together?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's related to one in the chat from Jenny Mazer. Did some members of the families with freedom suits despair and try to escape to freedom?
Okay.
Yes. And then Patrick Gossett is asking how often were the freedom suits successful, and was there a historical point at which the success rate changed? These are excellent questions, and they're related. So that's why I've pulled them out of the chat to kind of connect them. The freedom suits were highly successful early in this period. So for Maryland, they were highly successful in the 1780s and 1790s, and into the 1800s, just the first decade. By 1810 in Maryland, slaveholders had largely shut the court down that tried the freedom suits. Okay, that's the court in Annapolis. It's called the General Court of the Western Shore, and it was closed in 1804. And so that meant that all freedom suits had to originate at the county level, where slaveholders really had the most authority, the most power at the local level, because most of the jurors at that county level would be well known to the defendant slaveholders, right? And many of the jurors in Prince George's County were white men who were slaveholders. So, the answer to Patrick's question is important. It changes over time. The success rate early is like 70%. I mean, it's very high. After the 1810s in Maryland, there are very few freedom suits in the courts. I have not done a complete survey of all counties And I've got a graduate student who's working on that. I've got a graduate student who's working on the Eastern Shore, Dorchester County in particular, to track the freedom suits there. But Patrick, the freedom suits are highly successful early, like about 70%. And then later in Maryland, from what I can tell, they're less likely. There are just fewer of them. Okay. Now, what happens is many enslaved people, including the queens, know that they have a better shot at winning a freedom suit if they are somehow taken to Washington, D.C., because the DC, there are various laws that come into play, technicalities in the law related to importation. And Maryland had passed a non-importation law, and it had repercussions on the DC Maryland boundary and the Virginia Maryland boundary in DC. So the jurisdiction, the new jurisdiction of DC, whose jurors were not the same as the jurors in Prince George's County, right? The courts might be more favorable, and there were more technical ways to bring freedom suits. And in answer to Patrick's question, the suits of the 500 suits in Washington, D.C., the ones we know the outcome for, more than 50% are successful. So that's a very high rate of success. But not all were successful, right? Mina Queen did not win her freedom suit. I mean, in the Supreme Court case that we were talking about, she did not win her freedom suit. And, you know, Jenny's question, and it's related, Susan, to yours, is do those families then decide to run away, to just take other measures? Oh, and also, do families attempt to run away in order to force a freedom suit, right? So there is a relationship there, but it's not as evident as like people who how did you put it, Susan, who did not succeed at running away, did they then file a freedom suit? And I've not found that to be the case. You know, in other words, there's this more complicated relationship between these strategies of freedom. There's another strategy that we've not talked about, and that's negotiation. I mean, negotiation of where an enslaved person or a family would certainly put pressure on, negotiate with slaveholders to at some point manumit them, maybe 10 years from now, maybe 15 years from now, maybe in a will. And that's often a place where if that promise or that negotiation, that contract is not kept, then enslaved people brought freedom suits for on the basis of a will or on the basis of a promised you know, a payment or a promised manumission. So I think what we need to do is think about these different strategies constantly in relationship to one another. That's what I mean. It's actually going back to the question we had earlier. These families, enslaved people, were sophisticated political, legal actors in a world in which they were negotiating, running away where necessary, filing freedom suits, using the courts. These are in relationship to one another. And the significance of this is really high because, and I'm going to go ahead and say, Clyde is on the call tonight. Clyde's comments at our meeting in Bowie about how important it is to understand that these freedom suits, these legal actions, that emancipation, I think, Clyde, as you put it, did not just happen because of white benevolence. It wasn't just white emancipation. It was Black families constantly maneuvering, acting in the world to secure their freedom and through the law. So, so that's the importance of the story.
Persistence.
Yeah.
Yes, persistence. We're probably nearing our time, so I'll ask very quickly for you to say something about freedom suits in other states. What?
Sure. Yeah. There were freedom suits in almost every state, and that's something we've not realized as well. Massachusetts effectively ended slavery because there was a freedom suit. Quock Walker filed a freedom suit, and the Supreme Court of Massachusetts declared slavery illegitimate and incompatible with natural law, and essentially ruled slavery outlawed. That could have happened in Maryland if the Queen and Mahoney cases had had a different result. But yeah, there were freedom suits in New Jersey, there were freedom suits in New York, there were freedom suits in Pennsylvania. There were freedom suits in Louisiana and South Carolina and Virginia, and all over the Atlantic world, Brazil, Cuba. So I think, again, rather than seeing freedom suits as somehow exceptional, just one singular, idiosyncratic, we need to see that they were part of this broader effort to dismantle or resist the idea of human property as somehow lawful, as somehow sanctioned by the law. So yeah, there were lots of freedom suits in other states. I'd like to put together a big national database of all the freedom suits. That's my goal.
I just wondered whether other scholars were pulling things together.
Oh, yes.
As
Oh,
you have.
absolutely.
And-
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Yeah, you'll see there's a number of other scholars working in this area. Ann Twitty, Kelly Kennington, lots of Martha Jones, right, at Johns Hopkins.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we should, there's Donna.
Yep.
Should we be sort of rounding up?
Yep. Yes, we have several good questions.
Oh, good.
So let me, I'll start with one from Franklin Robinson. Did you ever have a chance to look at the case Negro Jerry versus Townsend? It went through Prince George's and Anne Arundel County courts in the late 1840s, ending by 1856-57. It is credited with being the first class action suit in Maryland.
No, I have not, Franklin, and that is a mind-blowing question for me. So thank you for it. I will be looking into that in September when I come to Prince George's County, and when I'll be at Marietta House for a panel, and it'll be the first travel I have done since the pandemic. So that's amazing. I have not heard of that, and I want to look into it. So
Give me a call. I'm happy to share my research.
okay, thank you.
That's the Townsend.
Yeah.
Yes.
Got it.
Okay, Cynthia Nordone has a question. What is the connection, if any, between the freedom suits and the development of the hearsay rule?
Yeah. Well, there's a direct connection because Queen, and this is how I sort of started on this journey. Queen v. Hepburn is really the foundational case for the hearsay rule. It's the case where, and it's cited throughout American jurisprudence in the 19th century and even into the 20th, 21st century. It'll be cited as the case that defines the hearsay rule. Now, I had no idea that it was a freedom suit, and the hearsay rule was effectively defined in a way, in a case that would therefore exclude and render inadmissible the very evidence that would have proved this woman's and this family's freedom. And so I do think that it's at the, I mean, it's, to answer your question, it's right at the heart of the hearsay rule. The freedom suit is right at the heart of it. And I think there are many things in our lives today, in our legal structures, in our social structures, in our historical, the way we think about history, that, you know, if we knew the origins of them, might be less inclined to support them. And so that, or be quite as quick to dismiss evidence as hearsay, as somehow not as reliable. Because what I found is that the textual evidence, the documentary record in that case, was less reliable than the oral testimony. And so the hearsay rule may have very good reasons to exist, but this isn't necessarily one of them. And the case does not prove it. So it's one of those things we have to contend with today. Yeah, it's a
Okay.
great question.
The next question is from Charles Hendricks. What have you learned by talking with descendants of plaintiffs in freedom suits, both winners and losers, and how did you connect with them?
Well, how I connected with them came in a variety of different ways. One way was the Georgetown story sort of developed in, I was already 5 or 6 years into this research when the New York Times published a major piece on the Georgetown sale of 1838, and the descendants in Maringin, in Iberville, were suddenly visible in a way that I guess they had not been before. And the Georgetown Memory Project began. Richard Cellini and others began working on that and connecting descendants all over the country of the Jesuit sale. And of course, the Jesuit sale happens in many ways because, I mean, these the families, the Queens and Mahonys and others who were not liberated in freedom suits remained enslaved by the Jesuits and were sold in 1838. So the Georgetown Memory Project and other efforts put me in contact with the descendants in Louisiana. Susan Pearl and the Prince George's County Historical Society really helped put me in contact with Clyde and others who are descendants of the Duckett family. And I am a descendant of Duckett slaveholders. I talk about that in the book. The other place where those connections were made was through the website. The Shorter family, Amari Jackson and many of his relatives, just literally were, searching the web for family materials and found the Shorter family freedom suits on the website we were just talking about, and they wrote me, and that's happened a lot. I've had a lot of phone calls and email contacts just straight off of the website asking about these freedom suits. So really in a couple different ways. And you asked what I've learned. I've learned a lot along the way. But really it's about what I guess I would say is I've learned how proximate this history is. It's close to us. This is history that is felt. It's something that we feel today, and I think we have to acknowledge the painful aspects of that history and connect with people across these different historical understandings. I think there's a big gap in our American life between maybe many descendants and their historical understanding, just historical reality, and the historical reality or understanding of many white Americans. And I just think that gap needs to close. And the only way to do it is to be in the same room like this tonight and to talk about this history honestly and understand the truths in this history. And so I could say more, but I try to say a lot in the book too about these conversations.
Okay. This might be the last question, and it's from Mark Collins. Any thoughts about Francis Scott Key? He advocated on behalf of enslaved people in court, wrote the Star Spangled Banner, which is problematic, but also owned people.
Yes, I pondered Key a lot in the course of the last 10 years. He appears contradictory, right? But he appears contradictory only because we sometimes think that if he was a lawyer for all these enslaved families suing for freedom, he must somehow be, an abolitionist. And the reality is that he was not. He was not an abolitionist. He never stopped being a slaveholder. He certainly did represent enslaved families in these freedom suits, but I hesitate to use that as some kind of yardstick for his benevolence or something. I think with Key and with many people, he's a complicated historical figure. Yes, he represented enslaved families. He also was one of the prime driving forces behind the idea of colonization. And Key effectively decided that Black people could not be free in the United States, that they could be free in a colony in Liberia, in Africa. And we see these positions as contradictory. Key saw them as consistent. And that is the historical tragedy, right? And Key is in that way a tragic figure. He could not contend with the moral problem of slavery in front of him, even as he tried to see himself as a humanitarian, and in many ways thought of himself as a humanitarian. And I think that last, the lawyers involved and others, they have something to gain here, and we can't lose sight of that. He's got a career on the line. And these pro bono cases that he might do, they might help his career. These were big time freedom suits in different contexts that he could make a name for himself. So let's not always, I guess, I hesitate to ascribe to historical people motives that we wish to see in them, and I think we have to be careful to put them firmly in their context and really understand the complexity of their world.
Thank you, Will and Susan, for a great chat this evening. And thank you to our audience for joining us tonight. Our June 28th chat will be a conversation with Nathania Branch Miles, who will be discussing African-American genealogy. Also, hopefully you can join the Historical Society and several other Prince George's County organizations this Thursday for our annual Prince George's County Preservation Month reception. It starts at 7 p.m. So with that, good night, everybody. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Will. Great to talk to you again.
Thank you, everybody.